Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Maxie had become the tragic epicenter of Port Charles when her sudden collapse at home and heart sent shockwaves through the community. One moment she was standing in the spotlight, living out her professional dream, and the next she was crumbling before the cameras, her body giving way to an unseen force. The spectacle was horrifying, and as news spread, it seemed the entire town froze in disbelief. When she was rushed to General Hospital, Lucas was the first to act, refusing to lose her without a fight. He threw every ounce of skill and strength into reviving her, performing compressions, stabilizing her heart, forcing her back from the edge. At one point, her heart had stopped completely, her pulse gone as though she had already slipped away. For Lucas, the sight of Maxie lifeless on the table was more than medical, it was personal. He had already lived this nightmare once before with Sam, and the ghosts of his past were clawing at him again. When Maxie's heart finally stuttered back into rhythm, relief filled the room, but for Lucas, the agony didn't subside. He had saved her in the moment, but something told him the nightmare had only begun. In the hours that followed, Maxie remained unresponsive. She did not wake, her eyes closed as though in a heavy, unreachable sleep. Machines monitored her every breath and beat, but the picture they painted was grim. Her neurological responses were faint, her vital signs fragile, her condition hanging on by a thread. Lucas, who had seen countless critical cases before, knew there was something deeply unnatural about this. Her collapse hadn't been random, and the standard treatments weren't working. He couldn't allow himself to sit idly by and wait for her body to heal on its own. Driven by both his medical instincts and the desperate weight of personal guilt, Lucas began ordering a battery of tests, digging into her system cell by cell, searching for a clue that might explain the unexplainable. The turning point came when the biopsy results landed in his hands. What Lucas read made his blood run cold. The tests revealed traces of a rare and highly specific toxin threaded throughout Maxie's system. It wasn't something that could be explained away as contamination or a freak accident, it wasn't in any medication she had been prescribed, nor was it a substance found in food or drink. It was deliberate, designed to slip past detection and mimic natural medical emergencies. In that moment, Lucas's heart sank under the crushing realization that this had not been a medical crisis by chance, it was an attack. Maxie had not collapsed because of her own body. Someone had poisoned her, someone had wanted her silenced. A surge of anger and despair tore through Lucas. His hands trembled as he held the lab results, his mind spinning through every possibility, every scenario that could have led Maxie here. He couldn't fathom why she had been targeted. Maxie was no stranger to chaos, but she was not a woman who made enemies of the kind who sought to kill. She was a mother, a friend, someone trying to live her life in the small spotlight of Port Charles. Who could possibly hate her enough to engineer this? Lucas's stomach knotted as the darker truth began to form in his mind. This wasn't about Maxie personally. She was collateral, a piece in a much larger game. Then came the detail that twisted the knife. The toxin itself wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Cross-referencing chemical data, Lucas found that the compound had been noted before, a rare signature tied back to experimental work that had once been linked to Jen Sidwell. Sidwell, a man whose reach was long, whose influence was steeped in cruelty, and whose name was synonymous with corruption in Port Charles. Lucas's chest tightened as he processed what this meant. Sidwell's involvement wasn't just a possibility, it was almost a certainty. And the cruel irony was unbearable. Sidwell wasn't just a shadowy figure from Port Charles's criminal underworld. He was Marco's father. The revelation was devastating. Lucas's mind and heart collided violently as he tried to reconcile the implications. The man lying in the hospital bed beside Maxie, whispering promises and offering him solace during long nights, was Marco. The man who had given him hope again after so much loss, who had shown him love when he thought he might never find it again. And now, that same man was bound by blood to the one Lucas believed had orchestrated this horrific attack. It wasn't just a medical crisis anymore, it was personal. Lucas was trapped between loyalty to his cousin and his duty as a doctor, between the love he was building with Marco and the fury that burned in him at the thought that Marco's father might have orchestrated Maxie's collapse. The weight of history bore down on him. He had already failed Sam. He had stood in an operating room and watched her slip away, powerless to change the outcome. That memory haunted him every day, and now, as Maxie lay lifeless under fluorescent hospital lights, he felt the same crushing guilt clawing its way back into his soul. If he couldn't save her, if he couldn't bring the truth into the light, it would be another scar he carried forever. But exposing the truth meant risking everything: his relationship with Marco, his place in the hospital, his very ability to function in the life he had rebuilt. Lucas knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was no longer just about saving Maxie's body. It was about unraveling a conspiracy, about unmasking a man who thrived on manipulation and destruction. And as much as his heart ached to protect Marco, Lucas also knew that love built on lies and silence could never last. The poison inside Maxie was not only tearing apart her body, it was tearing apart the fragile threads of Lucas's own world. And so he stood in the silent hospital corridor, staring through the glass at Maxie's still form, his reflection pale and haunted beside hers. He understood the truth: Port Charles was about to plunge into yet another storm, and this time the battle wasn't only for Maxie's life, but for his own soul. The decision he made next, whether to confront Marco, to expose Sidwell, or to bury the truth, would decide not only Maxie's fate, but the future of everyone he loved. Lucas's life had always been shaped by the tension between his calling as a healer and the personal tragedies that seemed to stalk him no matter how far he tried to run. But nothing could have prepared him for the unbearable intersection he now faced, the moment where medicine, morality, and love collided with such ferocity that every decision felt like a betrayal. Maxie's collapse had begun as a medical emergency, but it quickly became something darker, a vortex that pulled Lucas into an abyss of impossible choices and sleepless nights. The hospital room was suffocating. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the faint scent of antiseptic, it all pressed in on Lucas like a cruel reminder that Maxie's life was being sustained by machines rather than her own strength. He sat for hours at her bedside, his hand resting gently over hers, staring at her face for even the slightest twitch or flutter of consciousness. But Maxie gave nothing back. Her body remained locked in its unnatural stillness, as if caught in a battle invisible to everyone but her. The doctors who consulted with Lucas offered cautious sympathy, but even their eyes betrayed doubt. Days were slipping away, and the longer she remained unresponsive, the slimmer her chances of ever returning whole. For Lucas, the anguish was doubled by memory. He could not separate this moment from the ghost of Sam, from the long nights of fighting for her only to lose her anyway. He saw Sam's lifeless eyes every time he closed his own, felt the same crushing weight of guilt pressing into his chest. Now, watching Maxie, he felt history dragging him backward, pulling him into a cycle of loss he was powerless to break. But this time, he knew the truth. Maxie wasn't just the victim of a tragic twist of fate, she had been poisoned, deliberately, and the knowledge of that fact made the torment almost unbearable. The lab results were still etched into his mind, every number and chemical compound like a brand he could not erase. The toxin was rare, sophisticated, designed not to kill immediately but to destabilize and destroy over time. It wasn't random. It was chosen. And the further Lucas dug into the toxicology, the clearer the fingerprints became, fingerprints not in the literal sense, but in the unmistakable mark of a man who had engineered countless forms of destruction before. Jens Sidwell. The name was like venom itself, coursing through Lucas's veins every time he thought of it. What tore Lucas apart wasn't just the realization that Sidwell was likely responsible. It was the unbearable irony that Sidwell was also the father of Marco, the man Lucas had only just allowed himself to love. Marco, who had stood beside him through long shifts, who had made him laugh in the face of despair, who had reminded him that he was more than just his mistakes and losses. The love was new, fragile, but it mattered. And now it was tangled with the darkest truth Lucas had ever uncovered. Every glance at Marco became an agony. Lucas felt himself flinch whenever Marco mentioned his father, even casually. He found excuses to avoid conversations that brushed too close to the subject, his silence growing heavier with each passing day. Marco noticed. He saw the way Lucas's shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes clouded with something unspoken. He noticed the late nights Lucas refused to leave Maxie's side, the way he would pore over test results long after others had gone home, chasing something unseen. Marco's instincts whispered to him that a secret hung between them, one powerful enough to shake the foundation of their bond. Lucas was aware of it too. He saw the questions in Marco's eyes, felt the distance widening like a crack in glass, threatening to shatter under pressure. And still, he couldn't bring himself to speak the truth. To tell Marco everything would mean tearing his world apart. Marco would have to face the reality that his father, the man he had tried to build a complicated peace with, was capable of poisoning an innocent woman. It would destroy him. Yet to remain silent meant betraying Maxie, betraying his own oath as a doctor, betraying the very core of his being. The weight of this choice followed Lucas everywhere. In the sterile brightness of the ICU, in the dim corridors of the hospital at night, even in the quiet moments when he closed his eyes and tried to rest. He would see Maxie's face, pale and lifeless, and then Marco's, full of trust and hope, and he felt himself split in two. Both demanded loyalty, both deserved truth, and yet their realities were irreconcilable. Meanwhile, Sidwell remained an invisible presence, like a storm cloud hovering on the horizon. Lucas could feel his influence in the shadows, in the fear that lingered in hushed conversations, in the knowledge that Sidwell always seemed to be one step ahead of those who tried to bring him down. If Lucas made the wrong move, if he confronted Sidwell without ironclad proof, it wouldn't just cost him his relationship with Marco, it could cost him his career, his freedom, even his life. Sidwell had crushed men stronger than Lucas before, and the thought of standing against him was enough to make even the bravest soul hesitate. But Maxie didn't have time for hesitation. Her body was weakening, her organs strained from the damage of the toxin. Lucas monitored every fluctuation with obsessive vigilance, knowing that every downturn could be the one she wouldn't recover from. He found himself bargaining with fate, promising silently that if Maxie survived, he would find the courage to do what was right, no matter the cost. Yet with every hour that passed, his promises felt emptier. Marco, for his part, could not stand the silence any longer. He began pressing Lucas with gentle questions, trying to understand what was eating away at him. Why the coldness whenever Sidwell's name was mentioned? Why the sleepless nights? Why the distance that had grown between them like a wall? Lucas would deflect, offering vague reassurances, but Marco's intuition refused to let go. He could feel that his lover was carrying something unbearable, and he feared that the secret itself would destroy them before Sidwell ever had the chance. The tragedy had become more than just a battle for Maxie's survival, it was a war inside Lucas's own heart. Each decision was a knife, to speak or to stay silent, to protect Marco or to protect Maxie, to follow love or to follow truth. And in the quiet hours of the night, sitting at Maxie's bedside with the monitors beeping softly in the background, Lucas knew that the time for indecision was slipping away. He could not hold both worlds forever. At some point, he would have to choose. The weight of Maxie's tragedy spread outward like ripples in a dark pond, touching every soul connected to her. The hospital became a revolving door of family and friends, each arrival carrying their own form of desperation. Lulu came almost every morning, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, whispering words of encouragement at Maxie's bedside, hoping that somehow the sound of her voice would penetrate the veil of unconsciousness. Brooklyn alternated between restless energy and raw tears, sometimes pacing the corridors with fury at the injustice of it all, sometimes crumpling into a chair with her face buried in her hands. Even those who had grown distant from Maxie found themselves drawn back to her bedside, pulled by the invisible thread of fear that she might slip away forever. The waiting room was thick with grief and unspoken prayers, as though the entire circle of Port Charles was holding its breath, unwilling to exhale until Maxie's eyes opened again. But Lucas knew the truth none of them could face. Their vigils, their words, their tears, none of it mattered if the root of Maxie's suffering remained untouched. She was not lying there because of bad luck or fragile health. She was a target, a victim of a hand that had deliberately chosen her. Every beeping monitor was a reminder of the toxin still coursing through her veins, each faint flutter of her heartbeat another second stolen by the cruelty of a man who thrived in shadows. Lucas could not bring himself to tell them, not yet. To look into their pleading faces and explain that this was not fate but an act of murder would shatter them beyond repair. Yet the silence gnawed at him, because with each day of inaction, the poison continued its slow destruction, and the evidence that pointed toward Sidwell grew colder. The truth Lucas held was like a live grenade clutched to his chest, seconds from detonation. He had two choices, and both carried devastating consequences. If he continued to stay quiet, Marco would remain safe from the unbearable truth about his father, but Maxie's case would stagnate, her life hanging by a thread while Sidwell covered his tracks. If he spoke, if he brought Sidwell's name into the light, he would be ripping apart the fragile fabric of his own life, destroying Marco's trust, obliterating their relationship, and placing himself directly in the crosshairs of a man who had destroyed countless others before him. Every option was a blade, and whichever one he grasped would cut him deeply. Maxie's condition worsened in fits and starts. There were days when her vitals seemed to stabilize, when hope dared to creep back into the room. Then came sudden drops, her pulse stuttering, her blood pressure crashing, her body reminding them that she was far from safe. Lucas lived with his stomach knotted, waiting for the next alarm to shriek, for the next crisis to send him and his team scrambling to keep her tethered to life. He couldn't eat. He barely slept. He sat by her side long after visiting hours ended, clinging to her hand as though his presence alone might keep her tethered to this world. But even in the silence, the weight of Sam's ghost pressed down on him, a cruel reminder of how helpless he had once been and how close he was to repeating the same loss all over again. Sidwell's name grew sharper in his mind, like a knife twisting deeper with every thought. Lucas reviewed the toxicology reports until the numbers blurred, searching for mistakes, for alternate explanations, anything that would absolve Marco's father of guilt. But the evidence was merciless. The compound was too specific, too deliberate, too much like Sidwell's known methods. Lucas would lie awake in the on-call room, staring at the ceiling, imagining Sidwell smirking in the shadows, daring him to make a move. He knew Sidwell had eyes everywhere, influence in corners of Port Charles that no one could escape. To accuse him without an airtight case would be reckless suicide. But the longer he waited, the more Sidwell erased his tracks, and the harder it would become to ever hold him accountable. Marco felt the shift too. Their once bright, tentative love had grown dim under the weight of secrets. He noticed the way Lucas avoided his gaze when Sidwell's name came up, the way his voice tightened, the way his hands clenched just a little too hard around Maxie's test results. Nights they once spent together were now swallowed by silence or distance, Lucas slipping away to spend hours alone in the lab or by Maxie's side. Marco tried to be patient, tried to believe Lucas's vague reassurances that he was simply exhausted, but the unease built inside him like pressure beneath glass. He knew something was being hidden, and his heart feared it was something that could destroy them. Lucas lived in torment, pulled apart by the impossible conflict between heart and duty. Each day, Marco's presence was both a comfort and a reminder of what he stood to lose. Each night beside Maxie was both an act of loyalty and a stab of guilt for keeping the truth buried. He imagined the fallout over and over again, Marco's face when he discovered the truth, the betrayal in his eyes, the shattering of something that had only just begun. And then he imagined Maxie's eyes, opening only to demand why he had let her suffer in silence, why he had not fought harder, why he had chosen love over justice. Both visions destroyed him, but one of them had to become real. The city itself seemed to sense the storm building. Port Charles had known chaos before, but this was different. This was not a mob war or a business feud, it was quieter, more insidious, a poisoning at the heart of its community. Whispers spread through town, each person with their own theory, each rumor weaving a net of suspicion. The more people speculated, the more Lucas realized how quickly truth could turn into wildfire if not handled with precision. He could not afford to stumble, because once the first accusation was spoken aloud, there would be no turning back. And so, Lucas hovered in paralysis, the seconds bleeding away as Maxie remained suspended between life and death. Every decision weighed heavier than the last. The silence threatened to crush him, but the truth was a blade that could cut him just as deeply. He stood on the edge of a precipice, knowing that whichever step he took would alter the course of lives far beyond his own. Maxie's tragedy had become the heart of Port Charles's next reckoning. Her still body was more than a medical crisis, it was a symbol of betrayal, of cruelty, of a crime that demanded justice. And Lucas, torn open between love, loyalty, and duty, was the unwilling gatekeeper of that truth. The choice he made would determine not only whether Maxie survived, but also whether Port Charles itself would be torn apart by the storm Sidwell had unleashed.